It was an ordinary day in a luxury boutique where expensive fragrances mingled with arrogance and distrust. A black customer, smiling, stepped through the glass doors, unaware that in a few moments he would be the victim of a blatant injustice. His welcoming gaze met the manager's eyes cold and full of suspicion. What happened next is hard to imagine, but we promise you this story will leave you shocked. With an accusation filled with contempt and racism, the manager loudly announced that our hero had stolen something from the store. Humiliated and frightened, the shopper found himself surrounded by indifferent stares from customers who were more interested in the brands on the shelves than in justice. But the truth will always find a way out, and in this story, it will win in the most unexpected way. We appreciate each and every one of you watching this video, and you really are incredibly important to us. We want to get to know you better. Write in the comments what your name is and where you're watching us from. Your comments and support help promote our channel and spread such important, thought-provoking stories. You are the heart of our community, and it's because of you that we can tell the world that truth is always stronger than lies. So buckle up and get ready for an emotional roller coaster, because this story will grab you from the first minute and won't let go until the very end. Thank you for being with us. We appreciate you more than you can imagine. The main street of the city was crowded on this sunny day. People strolled leisurely, enjoying the warmth and rare moments of peace amidst the frantic pace of the metropolis. A prestigious store, located in the heart of the shopping district, shimmered in the sunlight. Huge windows glittered, luring shoppers in with brightly colored signs and neatly arranged designer items. Inside, the atmosphere was full of the scent of freshly cut flowers and expensive perfumes, mingling smoothly in the air with the subtle notes of polished wood. Soft background music added lightness to every movement of the visitors, while the store's employees were leisurely shifting the merchandise, maintaining impeccable order. The glare of light played on the perfectly clean surfaces, giving the whole space a sense of elusive luxury. A young couple was looking at a collection of branded handbags, animatedly discussing which one would go better with their new outfit. Nearby, at a glass rack with jewelry, a mature woman was trying on earrings. Catching the reflection of her satisfied eyes in the mirror, a small group of teenagers laughed at the register, admiring their new sneakers and dreaming of the day when they could afford the same ones. It was one of those places where everyone felt part of something special, as if they had touched the world of high fashion and status. The soft voices of salespeople, the discreet laughter of customers, the rustling of packages, all this was created by a skillfully designed atmosphere of comfort and relaxation. And it was into this deceptively calm and peaceful picture that our protagonist entered. A tall black man with a good-natured smile on his face stepped through the glass doors, holding a shopping list neatly rolled up in his pocket. He felt as confident and relaxed as any man going about his business on a beautiful day. Everything around him seemed as familiar and normal as it always had. It never occurred to him that in a few minutes, all this calm would collapse under the oppression of injustice and hatred, and his usual shopping trip would turn into a nightmare that no one deserved. Our hero, James Williams, was a man who radiated warmth and calm wherever he went. Tall, statuesque, with a wide smile and deep brown eyes, he always attracted attention not only by his appearance, but also by that special charm, which is impossible not to notice. Today James was dressed in simple but stylish clothes, neatly ironed light shirt, dark jeans and comfortable sneakers. On his left wrist glistened an old but favorite watch, given to him by his mother when he graduated from university. It was one of his dearest memories, a symbol of her pride in his accomplishments. James worked as an elementary school teacher and was respected in his neighborhood for his dedication. He was the kind of person children ran to with eager eyes to show off their new drawings or talk about their victories. People who knew him always spoke warmly of him, noting his kindness and willingness to help everyone. He often spent time volunteering his time helping the local community. When he had free time, James loved to enjoy the simple pleasures of life: a good book, a walk in the park, or shopping for something new and interesting. Today he'd gone to an upscale store to buy a gift for his niece, who was about to turn 10. She loved everything shiny and bright, and James wanted to find something special that would make her glow with happiness. His mood was elevated, almost festive. He mentally pictured himself handing over the gift, his niece hugging him, and her face lighting up as she unwrapped the box. This image made him feel genuinely happy and light. Entering the store, James didn't immediately notice the stares directed in his direction. He was too busy thinking about his upcoming choice and lightly humming to himself one of his favorite songs. He said hello to a young salesman who passed by and was pleased to hear a welcoming good afternoon. In return, everything seemed normal, as it should be in a place like this, where customers are greeted with respect. James moved between the rows of merchandise, studying the displays with interest and leisurely pace. There was no hurry, and it was the rare day when he could enjoy the process. He would even nod his head to the music coming from the speakers, or chuckle a little at something funny, like a strange collection of designer hats that looked more like works of art than hats. With the same good-natured openness, he approached the rack of jewelry for children, hoping to find the very gift for his niece. At that moment, James couldn't imagine that his joy and carefree attitude would soon collide with something dark and unfair. James stood in front of the huge glass doors, beyond which stretched the space of the boutique, as shiny and bright as an illustrated cover of a glossy magazine. He paused for a moment to take a deep breath of the fresh city air, savoring the warmth of the sunlight that touched his face affectionately. His mood was elevated and his thoughts light and carefree. All he wanted at that moment was to find the perfect gift for his favorite niece and perhaps treat himself to something nice. With a slight smile, James stepped forward and opened the glass doors. A soft chime, announcing the arrival of a new customer, echoed through the air, welcoming him. At that moment, James had no idea that for someone, that sound would be a signal of alarm, a cause for hidden irritation and unfounded suspicion. So far, however, nothing betrayed the impending storm that was about to erupt. He stepped inside with the confidence of a man accustomed to the comfort of such places. The cool air of the air conditioner pleasantly refreshed his skin, contrasting with the warmth of the street. The soft lighting skillfully emphasized every detail of the luxurious decor, from the elegantly curved display cases to the neatly arranged merchandise, each of which spoke of the status and high class of the store. It seemed that everything had been thought of to make customers feel important and respected. James took a few steps forward, looking around with mild curiosity. He was sure this store was perfect for finding a gift. It had the best brands, quality items, and attentive service. He didn't notice how several employees instantly stopped talking amongst themselves and turned in his direction. Their glances that slid over his figure were far from welcoming. But James, preoccupied with his own thoughts, didn't pay it any mind. He headed toward the display case of children's jewelry, anticipating his choice of gift. Each step sounded softly on the smooth marble floor, but still caused a strange tension in the surrounding space. Somewhere at the edge of the hall, near the cash register, one of the employees, a young man in an expensive suit, squirmed in tension. He exchanged a wary glance with another employee, and the silence between them became more noticeable. Meanwhile, James, still unsuspecting, was leaning over the display case, studying the silver bracelets and cute animal-shaped pendants. His good-natured smile was still on his face, and he continued to enjoy his shopping, unaware that just a few feet away from him, events were unfolding that were about to turn his day upside down. And behind his back, behind the glass doors, the world went on with its life, unaware of the injustice that was slowly but surely beginning to thicken over this quiet, seemingly perfect store. The store manager, Thomas Richards, stood at the counter, lazily thumbing through papers and half-idly watching the scene around him. Tall, with neatly styled blonde hair and an expensive suit, he embodied the image of a man accustomed to control and power. His manners were always slightly condescending, and his gaze was cold, evaluating. He treated his duties not just as a job, but as an opportunity to constantly demonstrate his superiority over others, especially those who, in his opinion, did not fit the image of the ideal boutique customer. As James entered the store, a beeping sound that Thomas normally didn't even notice somehow made him pay attention. He lazily looked up from his papers and immediately felt a surge of tension. His gaze immediately narrowed into a sharp point of distrust, and a faint shadow of contempt flickered across his face. A black man, and in a store of this caliber, Thomas commented mentally with a chuckle. The stereotypes that he had never bothered to question were instantly swirling in his head. In Thomas's eyes, James was no longer an ordinary customer, but a potential threat, someone who couldn't just enjoy shopping in such an upscale place. His cold blue eyes lit up with suspicion, reinforced by his personal bias. which had nothing to do with reality, but everything to do with his own racist beliefs. Thomas straightened, setting the papers aside. His hand reflexively reached for the walkie-talkie attached to his belt, ready to call security at a moment's notice. He kept his gaze on James, as if expecting him to do something suspicious. The cold contempt hidden behind the mask of businesslike seriousness was evident in the way Thomas watched the man's every move. James, as he continued to study the display case, had no idea that he was the object of scrutiny and suspicion. His simple gestures, the tilt of his head as he gazed at the children's jewelry, or the way he gently ran his finger along the glass, as if imagining how that bracelet would shine on his niece's hand, all of it seemed threatening to Thomas. In his mind, James's every action seemed hyperbolized and exaggerated, as if ordinary human gestures could mean something dangerous. This guy is obviously out of business, Thomas thought through gritted teeth. In his mind, James was no longer a customer, but a potential criminal to be controlled. Deep-seated prejudice, fueled by fear and hatred, guided his thoughts. In that moment, James was convicted before he even had a chance to do anything wrong. The manager discreetly made a sign to the two employees standing nearby, who instantly picked up on his alarm. They moved closer, trying not to look too intrusive, but nevertheless ready to intervene at the first signal. A sense of power and superiority flared inside Thomas, but also a hatred that he didn't even try to hide. And James, immersed in his good thoughts and anticipation of joy, had no idea that behind his back they were preparing for actions dictated by nothing less than a cold, unfair bias that was ready to turn his day into a nightmare. Thomas Richards, the store manager, stood up a little straighter, his fingers involuntarily clenched into a fist, as if his body were preparing itself in advance for a perceived threat. An unpleasant feeling, as he himself would call it, spilled over his chest. Even though there was no actual threat, the feeling had nothing to do with actual facts, but only with his own deep-seated prejudices. It rose with every movement James made, making Thomas tenser and tenser as he watched the black man's every move. The manager couldn't just stand up and start openly following the customer, but his gaze, cold and penetrating, was practically fixed on James. Thomas cautiously stepped away from the counter and began to move slowly around the room, pretending he was just looking over the shelves and checking the order. In fact, he tried to watch James's every move stealthily, noting the smallest details, the way he put his hand up to the display case, the way he slowly shook his head, obviously thinking about something. Any movement that would have looked completely harmless to anyone else would have been a source of suspicion to Thomas. Thomas noticed James running his hand over the glass of the display case, and his imagination immediately started working in the wrong direction. What if he wanted to create a distraction somehow? The manager had spent a long watching television reports and reading news stories full of stereotypes about crimes allegedly committed by people like James, and it was all distorting his perception. He had convinced himself that this client might have been here for some dark purpose. It's probably best to keep an eye on him, Thomas thought, and his gaze grew more and more suspicious. His haughty face, with a sneer on his lips, betrayed his true attitude toward James. It wasn't just weariness in his eyes, but contempt caused by the unreasonable certainty that James belonged in a category of people who didn't belong here. As Thomas slowly approached, his footsteps sounded like heartbeats in the room, heightening the tension. He slowed down every time James made a movement, and scenarios of possible crimes instantly flared up in the manager's mind. Catching on to his behavior, several of the store's employees, all of them young and white, also began to glance over. It was as if the invisible wave of racism emanating from Thomas was sweeping over them, causing them to freeze in readiness. Now the tension began to fill the entire store like an invisible, suffocating fog. Customers passing by might not have noticed it, but for James, who had a keen intuition and was used to feeling the stares of the wishers, the moment was becoming more and more disturbing. His light, festive mood began to fade slowly. He felt something that was hard to describe in words, an implicit but palpable threat brewing in the air. Thomas kept moving, pretending to simply check the merchandise, but his eyes never took his eyes off James for a second. This black man, who had come into the store to get a gift for his niece, suddenly found himself the focus of unfair, humiliating scrutiny just because of the color of his skin. Tension rose, enveloping James and swallowing up all the good-natured joy with which he had walked in just a few minutes ago. The thoughts inside Thomas Richards's head were raging, and every one of them was drenched in the poison of prejudice. His gaze was fixed on James, and his heart, though for no reason, was beating faster. He clenched his jaws, barely containing the irritation that had no rational basis whatsoever. His mind was full of thoughts he'd never seen fit to question. "What's he doing here?" Thomas thought, his eyes flashing with an angry glint. Black guys like him don't go into stores like this just for fun. They're up to something, always. He looks too calm, too confident, holds himself like he can't afford this place, like he's one of our regulars. But I know people like him. They always think they can't act like the rules don't apply to them. It seemed to Thomas that James's every gesture was an elaborate trick. When James raised his hand to get a better look at one of the baby pendants, the manager inwardly tensed, as if preparing for immediate action. Maybe he's just pretending to buy something. That's what they do, a distraction until they find a way to snatch something of value. These thoughts grew louder and louder, swelling and taking over Thomas's consciousness. He felt like the real protector of the store, the man who must prevent an imminent disaster. In his mind, James was not just a customer, but a threat because, in Thomas's mind, people of color couldn't be in a place like this for an honest reason. The words he heard over and over in his friends' conversations came back to his mind, words that confirmed all of his racist beliefs. Black people are always looking for easy prey. They always want to get something for free. They don't know what real work and honest money is. Thomas didn't even think about how ridiculous and cruel his assumptions were. These stereotypes were the absolute truth to him. He believed that as a manager, he was paid to be on guard, to prevent any attempts at deception. And now his job was clear: to keep an eye on James, to keep an eye on him, to prepare for the possibility that at any moment this potential thief would make his first mistake. But the longer James stayed in the store, the more tension grew inside Thomas. He could feel his prejudice overwhelming him, a cold anger gripping his consciousness, fueled by absurd but painfully familiar suspicions. "I know it's only a matter of time," he thought, nervously biting the inside of his cheek. "He'll do something, and when he does, I'll be ready." This store is no place for the likes of him. At that moment, the store, shining with splendor and luxury, suddenly became cramped and stuffy, filled with the energy of tense anticipation. Thomas didn't realize that he was creating this atmosphere himself, feeding it with his racist thoughts and fears. But his prejudice was growing like a shadow that overshadowed all the good that the day might hold. James, completely unaware that he was being watched with such intensity and prejudice, finally made up his mind. He stopped in front of a display case where brightly colored children's jewelry shimmered under artificial light. Catching his eye with its playful beauty, his gaze slid over pendants with cute hearts, tiny butterfly-shaped diamonds, and engraved silver bracelets. It all reminded him of how his niece had once told him she wanted to be a real princess, with treasures and shiny jewelry. With a smile full of warmth and tenderness, he reached out and gently took one of the small pendants. It was a dainty silver heart, studded with small stones that shimmered softly in the light of the lamps. James held the jewelry closer, turning it to see how it shimmered and imagining how happy his niece would be to receive the gift. There was nothing but pure joy and love in his thoughts. But this moment, so simple and so full of sincerity, was a cause for even greater alarm and resentment in Thomas Richards. The manager stood nearby, breathless, watching James as if he were about to do something incredibly daring. Thomas's eyes narrowed, and he tensed as if he were preparing to jump. In his mind, the movement, the normal gesture of a customer looking at the merchandise, turned into an act of possible theft. "This is it," a thought flashed through Thomas's mind, and his heart beat faster. "He's got something. This is where it's going to start now. Watch closely. Don't let him get away." As he watched James uninterruptedly, Thomas didn't even realize that a clear picture of the alleged crime was already forming in his mind. He imagined James hiding the jewelry in his pocket, trying to sneak away, looking with disdain at this luxurious store, which, in Thomas's opinion, was never meant for people like him. These thoughts were eating away at Thomas's mind, fueling hatred and unreasonable fear. All around him, the atmosphere remained calm. The customers continued to look at the merchandise. The music was soft, the bags rustled, but to Thomas, James's every gesture, every movement seemed part of a complex, cunning plan. He saw not a man, but the embodiment of all his stereotypes, and it blinded him. making him see every little thing as a potential threat. James, unsuspecting, smiled as he pictured his niece's happy face. He had no idea that there was an invisible tension growing behind him, that someone had already passed an unfair judgment on him, simply because his skin color was incompatible with the shiny, perfect world of the boutique. James stood in the window, still absorbed in his choice of gift, and didn't notice how the eyes around him began to shift. Gradually, as if an invisible hand was guiding the movement, some of the customers began to look at him with growing curiosity and tension. At first, they were only brief glances, fleeting and barely noticeable, but then their attention became more and more insistent, as if they sensed that something about this man, this moment, was wrong. One of the first to arrive was a middle-aged woman, dressed in an elegant coat, who was initially looking at a display of designer handbags. Her gaze slid over James's figure, and she felt something that couldn't be explained in words, but it was something that made her freeze for a moment. At first, it was simple curiosity, but then it was an unenlightened fear that made her pull back a little, as if James posed a potential threat. Her thoughts were deeply imbued with the stereotypes she'd heard and absorbed over the years. They are always so suspicious. They often commit theft. There was a young couple standing next to her, laughing and discussing the latest designer show, but the happy conversation broke off as soon as they noticed that James had taken the jewelry in his hands. The girl tensed slightly, her laughter hushed, and the guy frowned, lowering his voice and gesturing for them to move to another row. Their behavior wasn't overly hostile, but there was an implicit unease in the air, an invisible energy that could be felt by anyone who held James' gaze. It was impossible to deny that this tension did not just arise, but stem from prejudices deeply rooted in society. Those around them did not even realize how much their perceptions were shaped through the lens of racism. They had absorbed these stereotypes from childhood, filling their minds with distrust and fear of people who looked different. And now, in this perfectly lit atmosphere of luxury and security, those same inner fears were beginning to break through, causing people to observe James with unreasonable wariness. One of the store employees, a young man in his 20s, was aimlessly rearranging things on a nearby counter, but his attention was focused on James. He watched his every move, not even trying to hide his suspicion. Scraps of thoughts flashed through his mind. We were told to be on guard. He looks like the type to watch out for. And that inner monologue only fueled his distrust, making him keep his guard up. Their gazes, like invisible blades, began to wrap around James, who was still immersed in his thoughts, genuinely happy that he seemed to have found the perfect gift. But a feeling of heaviness, of invisible pressure, began to creep into his consciousness. He felt his shoulders become tense, and the ease with which he had entered the store now seemed distant and unattainable. It was as if an unknown force was trying to squeeze him from all sides, making it hard to breathe. James involuntarily looked up and looked around. Everything around him looked the same, a luxurious store. Beautiful windows, smiling salesmen, but there was something else bubbling beneath the surface, something that had no clear shape but was deeply tangible. His gaze met for a moment with a woman in an elegant coat, and she quickly looked away, pretending to be interested in another shop window. But James sensed that moment, that barely perceptible gesture, full of distrust and wariness. He suddenly realized that he had become the center of other people's attention, that his every move was being watched, that the gazes of those around him were no longer so neutral. An uneasiness began to rise in his soul, slowly but surely destroying his carefree mood. James had experienced this before, and he knew what it meant. He felt an invisible wall of prejudice come between him and the others, as if trying to shut him out, to stigmatize him, even though he hadn't done anything. And Thomas, the manager, stood nearby, watching the tension unfold and feeling his power and control over the situation grow stronger. Stereotypes that he had believed to be absolutely true were now being confirmed in his mind. He could see how James had caused the alarm, how people instinctively reacted, and it only fueled his sense of rightness. Thomas Richards watched James with an icy stare that concealed a simmering mixture of prejudice and hatred. The stares of the surrounding shoppers and the tension that hung in the air felt as if they were spurring him to action. In Thomas's mind, this wasn't just an observation, it was his mission, his duty. He saw himself as the last bastion of safety, the protector of this world, of luxury and prestige from someone he considered an outsider here. Everything about James's demeanor from his confident movements to his calm smile, irritated and alarmed Thomas, making him clench his teeth and squint. Taking in all of his supposed importance and power, Thomas strode determinedly toward James. His steps were quick and jerky, as if he were about to perform an urgent task. As he came closer, the air around him seemed to grow even heavier and more stifling. There was contempt in his eyes, displeasure in every feature of his face. James, still holding the small silver pendant in his hands, felt someone coming too close. He turned his head and faced Thomas's cold, hostile gaze. James's heart sank for a moment, and the slight smile on his face faded like a morning mist in the blazing sun. "I'm sorry, sir," Thomas began, but there was no hint of politeness in his voice. The words sounded like sharp knives penetrating the thin sheath of benevolence. "What are you doing here?" The question sounded not like ordinary curiosity, but like an accusation that filled the air with hostility. James looked at the manager with surprise, bewilderment in his eyes. He didn't immediately realize why he was being addressed that way, but the tension in Thomas's voice was impossible to ignore. James felt the invisible walls begin to shrink around him, the familiar sense of threat beginning to pulse in his chest. "I'm just looking at gifts from my niece," James replied, trying to remain calm. He picked up the silver pendant he held in his hand and added softly, "Here, I think she'll like this." But Thomas didn't care about the gifts or James's intentions. His eyes flashed with anger, and his lips twisted into a grin, as if he was sure he caught the culprit in the act. "Really?" Thomas said sarcastically, so sarcastic that the people around him frowned involuntarily, noticing the scene. "You know, I've seen a lot of things in this store, and people like you." He paused, making it clear that he meant not just a customer, but someone else, someone unsuitable. They always find a way to make trouble. Thomas's words hung in the air, heavy and filled with contempt. James felt anger rising in his throat, but he knew he couldn't let himself lose control. He was used to situations like this, used to those suspicious looks and the demeaning tone he was often addressed with. Each time, however, the feeling was as painful and humiliating as it had been the first time. "I'm just buying a gift," James repeated, trying to speak calmly, though a wave of resentment was beginning to rise inside him. "Do you want me to put it back?" But Thomas wasn't going to back down. He took a step closer, almost point blank, his face a look of undisguised contempt. "I don't know what you're up to here," he said through gritted teeth, "but I won't tolerate shoplifting in my store." The word struck James like a whip. The insult, hidden beneath the supposed professionalism, fell on him with all its weight. Behind Thomas' back, several shoppers frowned, watching the scene with curiosity. Some murmured, some looked away, but the tension was almost palpable, like a thick fog that made it hard to breathe. James felt his hands involuntarily clench into fists. He wanted to defend himself, to argue, to shout that this was all unfair, but he knew that every word would only play against him in this situation. Thomas stood in front of him, certain that he was right, certain that he had the power to judge people by the way they looked. Thomas was no longer hiding his contempt, nor the inner confidence that was swelling in him with each passing second. He stepped forward, his face tense, his eyes burning with a hardness that was now visible to everyone in the room. Confidence fueled by racist stereotypes overshadowed common sense. Everything in his body screamed that he felt he was the master of this territory, and now he was going to show his power. "Did you think you could pull it off so easily?" Thomas's voice sounded loud and sharp, like a slap. He spoke deliberately so that everyone around him could hear him. "I saw you fiddling with that pendant. You think we don't notice when someone tries to steal it?" These words, harsh and accusatory, echoed through the room, and everyone within earshot turned to look at what was happening. Conversations died down, and the eyes of the customers, full of curiosity and confusion, were fixed on the scene. Thomas's tone, full of authority and accusation, broke the fragile shell of normality that still held the situation from collapsing completely. The atmosphere instantly became electrified, the air literally shaking with tension. James stood in the center of this storm, realizing that the attention of the entire store was directed at him. It was painful and humiliating for him to stand there, under the manager's accusing gaze, to hear those words that equated him with a criminal, even though he had done nothing. A mixture of anger and despair flared in his soul, but he forced himself to breathe evenly, suppressing every flash of emotion. He knew that at times like this, even the slightest reaction on his part could be taken as confirmation of guilt. "Excuse me," James forced the word out, trying to remain calm, though his voice trembled. "I didn't steal anything. I was just looking at that pendant like any other customer." But Thomas didn't even try to listen to the explanation. His face was contorted in a grimace of disbelief, and he snorted contemptuously. "You know what I hate the most," he continued, his voice echoing through the room, penetrating every ear, adding to James's humiliation. "When someone comes in here pretending to be able to afford these things, but really just waiting for the right moment to steal them." A few people around him whispered discreetly. Some shook their heads in surprise. Some stepped back a little farther, not wanting to participate in what was happening. But everyone was absorbed in the moment. Every word, every gesture. A young woman with a child hurriedly took her daughter aside, as if she was afraid that she would somehow be touched by this scene. Several other people stood with expressions of confusion, not knowing which side to take. James felt like he was caught in a trap. He felt as if all the stairs were burning through him like bright spotlights, exposing every feature of his face, every detail of his clothing, every movement. He clutched the pendant in his hand, looking at Thomas with a pain and anger he tried hard to suppress. "I didn't do anything wrong," James said a little louder than he meant to, his voice sounding firm but trembling. "You didn't even check the cameras, didn't ask anything? You just assumed I was a thief, just because." But Thomas interrupted him, his voice even louder, even more threatening. "Because I know how it is. You think this is the first time. Stop lying, put that back and go away. We don't want people like you here." Those last words, filled with insulting overtones, hung in the air like a thunderclap that shook the very essence of justice. Thomas didn't even try to hide his hatred, and the meaning of those words was clear to anyone who heard them. The tension emanating from the manager had infected those around him, and now the entire store was immersed in an atmosphere of hostility and injustice. James felt the ground fall away from under his feet. Thomas's words, soaked with anger and contempt, hit him in the chest, knocking all the air out of his lungs. The shock was so intense that it felt like time stood still for a moment. His brain wasn't immediately able to process all the humiliation that had come over him at that moment. He stood in the center of the store, surrounded by stares that seemed prickly, caustic, like 1,000 needles piercing his skin. Shock stiffened his body, making it impossible for him to move. This had happened to him before: racial prejudice, judgmental attitudes, humiliation, but never before had he felt so defenseless and humiliated. His breathing became shallow, and he felt his palms sweat. His heart pounded frantically in his chest, echoing in his ears. How is that possible? Flashed through his mind. He had come here in a good mood, just to buy a gift, and now he stood in front of the entire store, accused of stealing, just because someone had decided to judge him by the color of his skin. The pain of this unfair accusation mixed with a growing fear. Fear that any word or action he said or did could only make things worse. Fear that he would become another victim of a system where his guilt was already predetermined. The eyes of the customers pierced him like needles, some full of bewilderment, others of hidden joy at another's humiliation. Some watched with frank curiosity, as if this was just another episode in their routine, not realizing, or perhaps not wanting to realize, the damage such accusations did to a person. James saw it all and felt the humiliation eating away at him from the inside, his pride turning into a thin, fragile shell. A lump came to his throat, but he forced himself to swallow it, trying not to let his emotions show. Tears of resentment and rage stung his eyes, but he struggled to hold them back. James knew he couldn't afford to look weak. He knew that any sign of vulnerability would be seen as weakness, as an admission of guilt. In this situation, his vulnerability became a weapon against him, and he knew he had to keep his composure. God, not now, he thought. Feeling despair began to fill him from the inside out. He looked at the pendant he still held in his hand, and his fingers involuntarily unclenched. The small piece of jewelry fell back onto the glass of the display case with a quiet clinking sound. That sound, so quiet and insignificant, seemed like the final blow, a confirmation that his dignity had been trampled here and now. In front of everyone, James took a deep breath, but his voice still shook as he tried to say something. "You were mistaken," he began, but his voice sounded quiet, too weak, as if the air around him refused to support him. He wanted to disappear, to dissolve, to get away from these looks, from these accusations, from this injustice that enveloped him like a suffocating fog. Anger and helplessness struggled inside him. He knew all too well that situations like this rarely ended in justice. He wasn't just a customer in this store. He was a target, a symbol of a bias this world was unwilling to eradicate. As the scene unfolded, the store, which had just had a calm and serene atmosphere, began to fill with a disturbing hum of whispers. The shoppers, who had previously been looking at merchandise or having casual conversations, were now completely absorbed in what was happening. Like an invisible spark, Thomas's accusations set off a wave of curiosity and indignation, but it was not the kind of curiosity that comes from a pure desire to understand the truth, but more like the avid attention that one pays to a catastrophe. "Did you see that?" the woman with the short blonde haircut whispered to her friend, shifting her eyebrows. "He must have done something." "Of course he did," said the other, shaking her head as if it were already clear. "People like that are always up to something." Judgmental glances slid over James, heavy and full of hidden gloating. People looked at him as if his guilt had already been proven, as if his very presence in the store confirmed all the worst stereotypes they'd ever heard. There was no sympathy or understanding in that look. Those around him saw not a person, but an image that fueled their own preconceived beliefs. An elderly couple standing by a rack of porcelain figurines glanced over, and the man sighed irritably. "You never know who's going to walk into places like this," he murmured, shaking his head slightly. His wife nodded, her face a mixture of contempt and alarm. In another part of the store, a young woman hurriedly took her young son aside, her eyes full of judgment. Her actions seemed overly dramatic, but she didn't even try to hide the apprehension she felt. It was as if James, standing with humiliation and pain in his eyes, was the threat she needed to protect the child from. Her thin whisper sounded like a hiss. "Let's get out of here. I don't want you to see this." Even those who tried not to interface couldn't help but stare judgmentally. Their eyes ran across James cursorily before they looked away again. But this fleeing only emphasized their prejudice. Each whisper was like a knife stabbing into his back, reinforcing the sense of helplessness and humiliation that was already consuming James. He felt like there was a barrier around him, invisible but tangible. It separated him from the other people in the store, making him a target for judgment and scorn. Their stares, their whispers, all of it made him an outcast, someone they didn't think deserved to be in this place. With each whisper, his dignity seemed to slip away, becoming something ephemeral and vulnerable. James felt surrounded on all sides. Every whisper was an indictment, every phrase sounding like confirmation of his guilt. Even though he had done nothing wrong, he looked around, his eyes darting over the faces of those around him, and there was a mixture of pain and confusion in them. He was just a man who wanted to give a gift to his niece, but now he was an outsider, an outcast, judged by a crowd who saw him not as a person, but as the embodiment of the stereotypes they had been stuffed with all their lives. Deep down, James knew that even if the truth came out, even if he proved his innocence, this humiliation, this moment when the whole store turned its judgmental eyes against him, would be impossible to forget. James inhaled deeply, trying to pull himself together. Though his heart was pounding frantically in his chest, he knew he couldn't afford to lose control right now. But the fear and humiliation that gripped him was so strong that his voice refused to sound firm. He looked at Thomas, and there was pain in his eyes that he preferred not to notice. The people around him were still whispering, looking at him with contempt, and those looks seemed to be pressing James from all sides. "Look," James began, his voice sounding quieter and shakier than he'd intended. He swallowed, feeling his throat dry. His usually strong and confident voice sounded uncertain now, like a man struggling to defend himself against an unfair accusation. "I didn't steal anything." He held up his palms, showing that they were empty, as if he wanted to prove his honesty, but his hands were shaking, and that only made him more vulnerable. James tried to remain calm, but his emotions raged inside him: fear, shame, anger. He felt cornered, surrounded by judgment and contempt, and couldn't understand how his day could have taken such a terrible turn. "I was just picking out a gift for my niece," he continued, his voice a little stronger, but still painful. "I held the pendant in my hands because I wanted to make sure it would fit." James paused for a moment, realizing that despite his words, Thomas was looking at him with the same expression of distrust and contempt as before. His explanation seemed pointless, the words flying into the void as if they had no power to break through the wall of prejudice erected in front of him. Thomas didn't react to James's words. his face rigid and stern, as if he had already decided that he was guilty, and no amount of evidence could change his mind. "Please," James' voice trailed off, and he felt the lump in his throat rise again. He glanced around at the people around him, hoping to find at least one person who would support him, who would realize how untrue and unfair what was happening was. But everyone stood there with the same judgmental expression on their faces, as if his explanation only confirmed their preconceived thoughts. Every word he said hurt in his chest. James didn't want to show his vulnerability, but the tremor in his voice gave him away. He could feel the tremor conveying his fear, his desperation, and it only made it worse. Those around him saw his weakness, his attempt to protect himself, and instead of showing sympathy, they only reinforced their judgment. His eyes darted to Thomas in a last attempt to reach his mind, but there was no sympathy in the manager's face. His gaze was cold and sure that he was right, and James realized that his explanations, however sincere, would not make a difference here. The silence that followed his words was like a sentence passed in a crowd that had already decided he was guilty. Thomas Richards looked at James, a contemptuous grin on his face. He crossed his arms over his chest and, as if finding amusement in James's desperate attempt to explain himself, let out a short, hard laugh. It wasn't a laugh born of genuine mirth, but a sound full of schadenfreude and condescension. It was the confidence of a man who was so consumed with his superiority that he didn't even try to hide his hatred. "Picked out a gift, didn't you?" Thomas shook his head slowly, as if he'd heard something completely ridiculous. His eyes narrowed, sparks of arrogant contempt in them. "You all say that. There's always an excuse, isn't there? I've seen it 1,000 times." He said the words with obvious sarcasm, his voice full of racist innuendo and contempt. He wasn't just accusing James of stealing, he was questioning the very fact that James could afford anything from that store at all. There were hidden stereotypes in his words that Thomas didn't even try to disguise. His tone was filled with the distrust that always haunted people who looked like James. "A gift for your niece, wasn't it?" Thomas raised one eyebrow, as if amused at how absurd that sounded. "How nice. Do you even have money for gifts like that?" He emphasized the word, putting emphasis on the fact that James supposedly couldn't afford to be a client of such a place. His whole tone and facial expression expressed his certainty that James was lying. A couple of young men standing nearby glanced over and grinned, as if Thomas had just made a particularly good joke. A few others around them tensed, not because of the injustice at hand, but for fear of being drawn into a conflict they'd rather watch from the sidelines. Some smirked, others simply looked away, trying not to meet James' gaze. James felt his face flaming with humiliation. Every word Thomas said, every sarcastic comment, cut him like blades. Rage was bubbling inside him, but it was bound by the chains of fear and helplessness. He'd had to hear such things before, and each time it hurt. But now, surrounded by people who didn't even try to take his side, surrounded by judgmental stares, it was unbearable. Thomas continued, as if wanting to humiliate James completely, making him not just guilty, but insignificant in the eyes of everyone around him. "I've seen you. You sly ones. First they pretend they want to buy something good, and then one day they're gone. Probably thought we wouldn't notice. You think you're so smart." Those words, filled with racist stereotypes, sounded like venom, spilling throughout the store. Thomas not only humiliated James, but used every opportunity to emphasize his prejudice, making everyone believe that James was an outsider, a man who couldn't be honest a priori. James stood there, struggling to contain the rage and humiliation that enveloped his heart and thoughts like a suffocating fog. His hands involuntarily clenched into fists, but he quickly unclenched them, realizing how dangerous even the slightest show of aggression would look. He knew he was already guilty in the eyes of Thomas and some of those around him, but he couldn't let his dignity be destroyed so easily. Taking a deep breath, he tried to pull himself together. His voice trembled, not from fear, but from the deafening, unbearable injustice that was tearing him up inside. He knew he had to stay calm, despite the bitterness that overwhelmed him. "Please check the security cameras," he said, trying to speak as firmly as he could, though pain and resentment tingled in every word. "You'll see I didn't do anything. I was just picking out a gift." His eyes met Thomas's, and there was despair mixed with anger in them. He hoped that at least this request would give the manager the slightest shadow of doubt, that his mind, though clouded by prejudice, would hear the truth. But Thomas only raised his eyebrows, clearly enjoying his position of power. He smirked, as if James had just suggested something completely absurd. There was no hint of understanding in his gaze, no desire to give James a chance to justify himself. "Cameras," Thomas interjected, stretching the word sarcastically. "Oh, now all of a sudden you want us to check the cameras. How convenient." He laughed, and there was a triumphant note in that laugh, as if he were sure he was right. "You know what? Maybe I'll call the police to deal with you. Do you think that would exonerate you?" He deliberately said it so loudly that everyone around him could hear, heightening the effect of the humiliation. James felt his heart hammering frantically in his chest. He realized that even mentioning the police here was risky, that calling the police on him as a black man could be even more dangerous, but he saw no other option but to prove his innocence. "Yes, please." James could barely contain the tremor in his voice, but his gaze was firm. "Call the police or check the security tapes. I didn't steal anything." His plea hung in the air, electrified with tension. The surrounding shoppers glanced around, some of them moving farther away from the scene, fearing that this could turn into something even more unpleasant. The whispers grew louder, and words full of distrust and prejudice could be heard. "Well, he must really be guilty of something if it came to the police. Let's see how he gets out of it now." Those words sounded like a sentence, and James felt even more isolated, even stranger among all these people who so easily believed in his guilt. But he wasn't going to give up. He stood upright, despite the humiliation, and demanded justice, even if the odds were against him. As soon as James voiced his request to call the police and check the cameras, the atmosphere in the store became tense. The tension that had already filled the space began to turn into something more sinister. The people standing on the sidelines watching the scene began to talk quietly, and their whispers spread like fire through dry grass, turning into rumors that grew into more distorted details. "Did you hear that? It sounds like he was trying to steal something," the older man whispered to his wife, and she took a step back as if she were standing next to a dangerous criminal. "Yeah, and now he says he didn't do anything," the other woman added, shaking her head in disbelief. "That's what they always say when they get caught." These words, filled with doubt and judgment, spread further, adding to the wave of hostility. Some shoppers began to feel real fear, although this fear was not caused by a real threat, but only a suggestive, preconceived panic born of mistrust and stereotypes. People began to leave the store, looking around nervously, as if any delay could turn into something terrible. "I heard he stole something and then started calling the police," the girl said, her fingers moving quickly across the phone screen, typing a message. Her face was tense, her eyes running around the hall, looking for confirmation of the rumors she'd heard. This must be some kind of trick. Hopefully it would end without incident. The word of mouth of fear was spreading not only among ordinary shoppers, but also among the employees. One of the salesmen, a young guy with a confused look, approached his colleague and asked in a whisper, "You think he's dangerous? I've heard they always get in trouble with the law." His colleague frowned and cast a concerned glance at James, who stood in the center of this maelstrom of hatred and distrust, still trying to look confident, though despair was tearing at him inside. Every whisper, every word spoken behind James's back sounded like another blow, another brick added to the wall of prejudice that no one wanted to break down. The looks people were throwing him were becoming more and more hostile, and now there wasn't even a hint of sympathy in them. They looked at him as a threat, as someone who had come here with bad intentions. There was a thick, sticky energy in the air, full of fear and judgment. Those who had initially paid attention to the scene were now watching James's face anxiously, as if he were about to do something dangerous. Everyone had their own scenario playing out in their heads. For some it was a drama involving a criminal. For others it was a potential threat to their safety. James could feel this mounting pressure beginning to weigh on his shoulders. He felt like he was standing in the center of a vortex that was about to swallow him up. He knew that his every movement was now viewed with suspicion, that every gesture could be misinterpreted. All he wanted was to defend his dignity and prove his innocence. But with every whisper, with every fear-filled look, that possibility seemed more and more distant. Around him, the store began to seem like a cage from which he could not escape. People shunned him, stepped aside, pretended they wanted no part of it, but still listened avidly to what was going on. The words Thomas had spoken had become a terrible truth for many here, and this realization was like poison coursing through the veins of public consciousness. The sound of sirens cut through the tense air, heightening the sense of impending trouble. Two policemen, dressed in dark uniforms with shiny badges on their chests, entered the store with a look of concentration and seriousness on their faces. Their presence instantly changed the atmosphere. The store, which had been filled with whispers and tense energy, fell into an oppressive silence, interrupted only by the sound of the footsteps of the arriving officers. The eyes of all present were now focused on the policemen, and many held their breath, as if expecting something terrible to happen. A few shoppers retreated further away, trying to stay out of the center of the action, while those who had not yet left watched the unfolding drama with morbid interest. Even those who had been whispering before fell silent, sensing that the tension had reached its peak. James stood still, feeling a cold wave of fear run down his spine. He knew that the arrival of the police did not bode well, even if he was completely innocent. He had learned it all too well over the years that for him, as a black man, any encounter with the law could turn tragic. Even if he was doing the right thing, his heart was pounding, and he forced himself to breathe slowly, trying not to look frightened. The policeman approached Thomas, who immediately began to speak, his voice full of smugness, as if he had finally found support in the face of the law. "Thank you for coming so quickly," Thomas said, pointing at James. "We have an attempted theft here. This man was acting suspiciously, taking the merchandise, and I'm sure he wanted to steal it." Thomas spoke loudly, clearly, and with an expression on his face, as if he were absolutely certain that he was right. He didn't even try to hide his contempt, and it gave his words weight. The policeman's eyes were on James immediately, and he felt their attention focused back on him. There was something in their gazes that always made him tense, wary, alert, ready for action, instantly recognizing him as a threat. "Sir, keep your hands where we can see them," one of the policemen commanded, his voice firm but not harsh. But for James, the words sounded like a sentence, like a signal that his every movement had to be perfectly controlled, so as not to provoke unnecessary aggression. James slowly raised his hands, showing that they were empty, his fingers trembling slightly. He could feel the cold fear gripping him as his legs began to shake. At this moment, he was not only humiliated, but scared to the core. He realized that any wrong word, any gesture could be fatal. "I didn't steal anything," he said, trying to speak calmly, but his voice still shook. "Please check the cameras. They'll show everything." The policemen looked at each other, and one of them stepped forward, staring intently at James. The officer's gaze was assessing, cold, but with a tinge of professional skepticism, like a man who was used to dealing with these kinds of situations. "We'll figure it out," he said, but his tone held no promise of justice, no assurance that James' words would be heeded. The atmosphere in the store grew more and more pressured. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The crowd gathered around them seemed to hold their breath as they watched the scene. Some saw it as a dramatic spectacle, others as a possible threat, but no one dared to intervene or express sympathy. James felt completely cornered, surrounded by a wall of distrust and prejudice. Thomas's words, full of racist stereotypes, still hung in the air, adding to the sense of injustice. He hoped that the truth would still come out, but that ray of hope was growing fainter by the moment. The policemen approached James with serious, tense faces. There was no hint of sympathy in their gestures or looks, no desire to deal with the situation from a neutral position. One of them, a tall man with sharp features, took the initiative. He looked at James carefully, his eyes scrutinizing every detail, his clothes, his expression, his tense hands, anything that might confirm or deny the accusations. "Now, sir," the policeman began, his voice firm and commanding, like a man accustomed to being listened to and obeyed. "We've been told that you've been acting suspiciously and may have been trying to commit a theft. Do you have anything to say for yourself?" The word excuse sounded like condemnation, and James felt a chill run down his spine. Everything he tried to explain before seemed pointless. Now his words were being questioned again. Now he was considered guilty until proven otherwise. James took a deep breath, trying to keep control of his emotions. "I didn't steal anything," he repeated, trying to speak as calmly as possible. Though his voice shook again, he felt the muscles in his throat tighten, and the lump rose again, making it hard to breathe. "I was just looking at a pendant I wanted to buy for my niece." The policeman's gaze remained cold and penetrating. as if he were trying to see the light in James's eyes. Instead of listening and trying to understand, he decided to press on. "An ace, you say?" There was doubt in his voice, emphasized by a subtle tinge of sarcasm. "Sounds very convenient. Can you prove that you have the money to buy this merchandise?" The policeman emphasized the word, as if the very fact that James could afford to buy from this store was absurd. James felt the blood rush to his face in humiliation. The question wasn't just insulting, it was humiliating to the core. The policeman wasn't just questioning his honesty, he was questioning his financial solvency, as if James had no right to be here and think about buying. Another blow to his dignity, another reminder that in the eyes of these people, his honesty was questionable simply because of his skin color. James frowned for a second, then slowly reached into the back pocket of his jeans to pull out his wallet. He realized that any movement he made could be perceived as a threat, so he moved slowly and carefully, showing his intentions. "I have money," he said, pulling out his wallet and showing some credit cards. "Here, you can look at it. I wasn't going to steal anything." The policeman squinted slightly, but made no move to accept the evidence. Instead, he turned back to Thomas, who was standing nearby, watching with undisguised pleasure as James went through this humiliation. "Are you sure of your accusations?" the policeman asked Thomas, but his tone made it clear that they tended to trust the manager. Thomas nodded with a serious face, pointing at James again. "Absolutely sure," Thomas said. He had been acting suspiciously from the beginning. People like him often try to steal things. It's just classic. Those words stabbed into James' heart like sharp knives again. People like him, stereotypes and prejudice disguised as confidence and concern for safety, made his innocence seem insignificant. All eyes were fixed on him again, and this time the condemnation seemed even heavier. James stood clutching his wallet in his hands, his breathing coming in quick, ragged gasps, tears of humiliation in his eyes that he tried hard not to show. He was surrounded by a wall of distrust, accusations, and racist stereotypes that gave him no chance for justice. In the midst of this agonizing scene, when the tension had reached its peak and James seemed no longer sure how to prove his innocence, a woman's voice suddenly rang out, piercing the heavy atmosphere of the store. "I'm sorry, but I think I can clear the air." All heads, including the policeman's, turned sharply toward the speaker. She was a young woman with brown hair neatly gathered into a ponytail. She was standing at the accessories counter and looked confident and determined. There was a look of annoyance and indignation on her face at the blatant injustice she had just witnessed. The woman stepped forward and her heels clacked softly on the marble floor, attracting even more attention. "I've been standing here the whole time and I saw what happened," she said, looking directly at the police officers, and then shifted her gaze to James, her eyes expressing sympathy and reassurance. "This man didn't steal anything. He was just picking out a gift like any other shopper." Her words came out loud and clear, like a welcome drop of common sense in this ocean of injustice. The policeman frowned slightly, as if they had not expected such interference, and turned to her. Thomas, who had just been enjoying his power over the situation, visibly paled, his self-confidence beginning to crack. He clearly hadn't counted on anyone daring to challenge his version of events. "Are you sure, ma'am?" one of the policemen asked, raising an eyebrow. He seemed reluctant to change his attitude, but showed a willingness to listen to the witness. The woman nodded, her gaze full of determination. "Yes, I'm absolutely sure," she said firmly. "I watched him as I picked out the accessories. He didn't take anything or hide anything. He acted just like any other customer in that store. And if you check the cameras, you'll see that I'm telling the truth." The woman's words hung in the air, breaking the chain of racist stereotypes and false accusations. The policeman's gaze became a little softer, but they were still wary. Now, however, things were beginning to change. For the first time, James had support, someone who saw him not as the embodiment of prejudice, but as a man wrongly accused. James looked at the woman, and gratitude flashed in his eyes. Her intervention was not only unexpected, but vital. He felt the tension in his chest ease a little, though the pain and humiliation still burned in his heart. This small act of justice seemed like a bright ray of light in this dark and unfair situation. "Thank you," he whispered almost inaudibly, not believing that someone had decided to stand up for him at a time like this. The woman turned to James and smiled softly, as if trying to convey some of her confidence to him. Her intervention had changed the course of events, but no one knew how far this fight for justice would go. The woman straightened up, took a deep breath, and gathered her thoughts. Her determined gaze turned to the police officers, who were listening intently, still with a reserved wariness. Thomas, the manager, stood nearby, his cocky expression now replaced by a tense one, and his lips pressed into a thin line. He clearly hadn't expected any of the customers to dare challenge his version of events. I repeat, this man did not steal anything, the woman said firmly, her voice confident and calm. I saw everything that happened here. He just looked at the jewelry like any other customer and did nothing suspicious. She turned to Thomas, and a flame of indignation lit up in her eyes. And you, she said, looking directly at the manager, have been following him with bias from the beginning. You purposefully stalked him because you decided it was suspicious, without even giving him a chance to show that he was just here to make a purchase. The policemen looked at each other, and a thoughtful expression appeared on some of their faces. Thomas felt a cold sweat run down his back. He tried to keep a cool expression, but his face betrayed his excitement. His fingers fumbled nervously with the keys in his pocket, and he bit his lip, realizing that the situation was quickly spiraling out of his control. Ma'am, are you sure this isn't just a misunderstanding? Thomas tried to squeeze, but his voice was no longer as confident as before. He realized he was losing the support of the crowd, and his power over the situation was melting like ice in the hot sun. The woman didn't flinch. Her gaze remained steadfast. Misunderstanding, she interjected with a note of sarcasm. No, it's not a misunderstanding. You decided right away that this man was guilty because it didn't fit your idea of a typical customer in this store. I saw you watching him from the beginning, looking for a reason to accuse him. At that moment, there was silence in the store again. But it was different. It was a silence filled with realization and change. The people who had been whispering and judging James now seemed less sure of their rightness. They began to realize that they had become part of the injustice created by Thomas' bias. Some of them averted their gazes, and others began to glance around, as if suddenly realizing that they had witnessed an unfair accusation. The policeman, hearing all this, softened visibly. One of the officers turned to James, his gaze not so cold anymore, and now he could see a glimmer of embarrassment in it. He realized that perhaps they had jumped to conclusions. Okay, the officer said, we need to check the security cameras to make sure what happened. Thomas gritted his teeth, realizing that his lies were beginning to crumble. He realized that if the cameras showed the truth, his accusations would be untenable and his reputation would be tarnished. But now he had no choice. The woman's testimony was too convincing, and the store that had been his realm was now the arena where his self-confidence began to crumble. As the officers made their way to the security counter to check the surveillance footage, the atmosphere in the store changed again. The tension that was still in the air was different now. It was the anticipation of imminent exposure. Thomas swallowed nervously, realizing that control of the situation was finally slipping from his grasp. A policeman summoned a guard, and the guard approached them with a disgruntled expression. The guard, a young man with thick dark eyebrows, looked a little worried. One of the officers had asked him to show him the camera footage that would show James as he picked up the pendant. The guard glanced at Thomas, as if asking for his tacit permission, but the manager had no choice but to nod. Of course, Thomas said, trying to hide his excitement. He realized that the truth of his actions was about to come out. As the guards searched for the records, information about Thomas's past slowly began to leak into the store. The people standing nearby began to whisper, and from these conversations details came out that had previously remained hidden. One of the first to speak was a woman who frequented the store. I heard this isn't the first time this has happened, she whispered to her companion. Leaning closer, this manager has accused innocent people before. They say he once called the police on a young couple just because they weren't dressed appropriately. Her companion, an older man with gray hair, frowned and nodded. Yeah, I've heard about that, too, he muttered. I think it was hushed up then, but I remember people talking about how Thomas was always going after certain customers, especially if they didn't look the way he thought visitors to the place should look. These rumors began to spread faster and faster, and soon there were several people in the crowd discussing similar incidents. There were stories of Thomas making unfounded accusations against other people, mostly minorities. They remembered how he had been rude to young boys who had just come into the store to look at the latest collections, or how he had kicked out visitors with loud accusations that turned out to be false. The woman who had witnessed and defended James had also heard these conversations and frowned as she realized the depth of the bias that guided this manager. She felt a surge of anger, knowing that people like Thomas had spent years hiding behind their power, humiliating and unfairly accusing others, relying on stereotypes and prejudice. When the camera footage was finally uploaded, everyone frowned in anticipation. The police officers and the guard were staring intently at the screen, where James could clearly be seen picking out the pendant. The footage clearly showed him just holding it in his hands, examining it from different angles, and then carefully placing it back on the display case. No sudden movements, nothing suspicious, just normal, ordinary buyer behavior. One of the officers turned to Thomas, his gaze stern. "Your client doesn't seem to have done anything illegal," he said, a note of irritation in his voice. "Why were you so confident in accusing him?" Thomas turned pale, his face contorted with fear and shame. He had no excuse, and he realized that his accusations were no longer just false. They were a symbol of his injustice and bias. Rumors of his past incidents began to grow louder, and people were no longer whispering about James, but about Thomas. The manager's reputation, which he had maintained for so long, was crumbling before his eyes, and now the whole store saw him in his true colors. The reckoning had caught up with Thomas, and he realized that the consequences for his actions would now be serious. When the truth finally came out, the store was filled with a heavy silence, as if everyone present held their breath, realizing the extent of the injustice Thomas had just committed. But the silence didn't last long. The people around him began to whisper, and then a few people stepped forward, expressing their outrage openly. "This is outrageous," the brown-haired woman, who had been watching in silence until then, exclaimed. Now her face showed righteous anger, and she stepped closer to James, as if to support him with her presence. "How could you accuse him like that without any proof, just because it seemed suspicious to you? That's obvious discrimination." Her words caused a stir among the other shoppers. A man in a business suit standing nearby nodded in agreement and stepped forward as well. "Yes, I saw how it all started," he said with a judgmental look directed at Thomas. "This man has done nothing, and you've been prejudiced against him from the start. This is unacceptable." The people who had been whispering and leering at James were now starting to come over to his side. A couple of young girls standing in the far corner came closer and expressed their outrage. "It's horrible. How could he be treated so unfairly?" said one of them, her eyes glittering with indignation. "You deserve an apology, and that manager should be held accountable." James, who had been tense all this time, suddenly felt a wave of support begin to soften the terrible humiliation he had just experienced. Looking at these people who had stood up for him, he felt the resentment and pain begin to dissolve, giving way to a sense of gratitude. He was stunned, but there was a spark of hope in his eyes. "Thank you," he said, his voice still shaking, but now from a mixture of emotions, relief, gratitude, and the surprise that people that didn't know were now standing next to him. The crowd around James was becoming more and more united in their outrage. People demanded explanations from Thomas, and some of them even filmed what was happening on their phones, ready to share the story with the world. The store that had just been a place of fear and injustice was now a battleground for the truth, and this time James wasn't alone. Thomas, seeing the situation change, turned even paler. His confidence had vanished without a trace, and now he stood at a loss, realizing that he was no longer in control of the situation. He opened his mouth to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. People were no longer supporting him, and the reproachful look of the police made him feel small and insignificant. "You owe me an apology," insisted the woman witness, who had been the first to stand up for James. Her voice was firm and unyielding. "To this man, to us, and to everyone you've ever wrongfully accused." The crowd began to cheer her words, and in that moment, James realized that justice, albeit belatedly, was beginning to be served. The policemen, realizing how unfairly they had been treated, exchanged glances of embarrassment and regret. One of them, the one who had first approached James and asked him to raise his hands, stepped forward, trying to make amends. His face showed deep remorse, and he no longer looked as commanding as he had a few minutes ago. "Mister, please accept our apologies," he said, lowering his gaze. We jumped to conclusions, and it was wrong. Now that all the facts are in, we realized that you were hurt and humiliated in ways you didn't deserve. The officer's words sounded sincere, but still couldn't fully make up for the horror James had been through. He was relieved, albeit bitterly, to know that at least at this point he had been treated with respect. James nodded, his face still a mixture of emotions. He wanted to say something, but the weight of what had happened still hung over him. A deep breath helped him to relax a little, but the inner wounds would still remind him of himself for a long time to come. But there was a glimmer of dignity in his eyes that he was trying so hard to keep. Meanwhile, attention had shifted back to Thomas. The people in the crowd were not going to let the manager go so easily. They were outraged by his behavior, and now that the truth was out in the open, they demanded justice. The woman witness, who had first stood up for James, stepped forward and looked at Thomas defiantly. "What about an apology from you?" she asked, her voice cold and hard. "You tried to destroy his reputation, humiliate him in front of all of us, and now that it's out in the open, you must be held accountable." Thomas opened his mouth to say something, but the words seemed stuck in his throat. He was cornered, and all his confidence was gone. He realized that he couldn't get out of this situation, that his lies and bias were no longer sheltered behind the walls of his position. At that moment, the shopkeeper, a tall man in an elegant suit, appeared from the back of the hall. He had evidently been summoned when the situation had begun to heat up, and now his face expressed extreme displeasure. He approached Thomas, and there was a look of disappointment in his eyes. "Thomas, this is inexcusable," the shopkeeper said, his voice calm but firm. "Your actions have not only harmed this man, they have tarnished the reputation of our establishment. I can't afford to keep a man here who makes mistakes like that." The owner's words sounded like a thunderclap. Thomas turned pale, realizing that his career in this store was at an end. He tried to say something, but the owner didn't give him a chance. "You're fired," he said firmly. "Leave the store." The crowd murmured, and many people breathed a sigh of relief, happy that justice had finally been served. Thomas, pale, cast one last look at James, a look of despair and the realization that he had lost. Then he turned silently and left the store, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor. James stood in the center of this chaos, feeling a wave of relief finally wash away much of the humiliation and fear. People began to applaud in support of him. Some approached him to shake his hand, some simply to express sympathy and respect. He was overwhelmed by this show of support, but at the same time felt that his dignity had been restored, albeit belatedly. Now, finally, justice has been served. James stood in the center of the store, surrounded by the support of strangers, but still feeling the weight of his ordeal. People around him were thanking him for standing up to injustice, apologizing for witnessing the scene, even expressing admiration for his stamina. But inside James was a mixture of relief, anger, fatigue, and a wish that such moments would never happen again. He looked at the woman who had dared to take his side and smiled gratefully. "Thank you for what you've done," he said, and there was genuine appreciation in his voice. "You have no idea how much it means to me." She smiled back, but there was sadness in her eyes. "It was the right thing to do," she said. "No one should have to go through something like that." James took a deep breath. Gathering his thoughts, he knew he had to say something to express what was in his heart. He stepped up a step so that it could be heard by the crowd and spoke, his voice full of strength and vulnerability at the same time. What happened today is not just an isolated incident. It happens every day to thousands of people around the world. He began, and his words penetrated the hearts of those gathered. Many of us know what it's like to be judged by mere appearance, how hard it is to prove your innocence when the world has already decided you are guilty. He paused for a moment to restrain the tremor in his voice. "Today I found myself here and I was unfairly accused. I felt my dignity stripped away. I felt threatened simply because someone decided to judge me based on the color of my skin. But today I also felt the strength that came from those who were not afraid to stand up to me, who chose to fight for justice, even if it was uncomfortable and difficult." James circled his eyes around the people who were now looking at him with understanding and respect. "We all need to keep fighting for justice," he continued. "We must speak out, raise our voices when we see injustice, and support those who face discrimination, because silence only reinforces prejudice and hatred." He took another deep breath and smiled, though his eyes still reflected the pain of the experience. "I am grateful to each and every one of you who stood up for me today. This is not just one man's fight. It is a fight for a world where we can all feel safe and dignified. no matter who we are or where we come from. The people around him applauded, some shouting words of encouragement, others wiping away tears. In that moment, James felt that his voice had been heard, that he had not only survived the ordeal, but had given hope to others who might one day be in his situation. Yes, the wounds would still hurt for a long time, but now he knew that even in the most difficult moments, it was worth fighting for truth and justice. Dear viewers, this story was not just about injustice, but about strength, dignity, and fighting for the truth. We know that such moments can touch each of us, and it is important to keep talking about them in order to make a difference. Please write in the comments what you think about this story. Have you experienced injustice or racism yourself? How did you deal with it? Your thoughts and experiences may inspire and support others who have also gone through similar experiences. We appreciate each and every one of you and are truly grateful to have you as part of our community. Your support, comments, likes, and subscriptions help us promote important stories and get people thinking about what's truly important. You truly mean more to us than you can imagine. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give us a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next stories. We strive to create content that will not only touch but also inspire change. We wish you a good day filled with light and kindness. Remember, you are important, you are needed, and your voice matters. Thank you for being with us.